turquoise waters of the Caribbean in February 1994 shimmered under an endless canopy of blue sky, the kind of postcard-perfect paradise that makes everything seem possible and safe. David Parks and his friend Jerry had come to this unnamed island seeking exactly this kind of escape: warm beaches, cold drinks, and the intoxicating sense of freedom that comes with being far from home and responsibility. They had been on the island for 3 days when they first heard about the cave. It was mentioned casually by a local bartender, the way people talk about minor attractions that tourists might find interesting. "There's this deep cave about 2 miles inland," he had said, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "Got a pool at the bottom. Pretty cool if you're into that sort of thing." To David and Jerry, both in their mid-20s and filled with the kind of confidence that comes from youth and vacation buzz, it sounded like exactly the sort of adventure they were looking for. Neither of them were experienced cave divers. David had done some recreational snorkeling in Florida, and Jerry had taken a basic scuba course the previous summer, but the idea of exploring an underground pool in a tropical cave seemed more like fun than danger. The next morning, they loaded a rented Jeep with snorkeling gear, 2 diving lights they'd bought at a local shop, some water bottles, and a waterproof camera. The drive inland took them through increasingly dense jungle, the paved road giving way to dirt tracks that wound between massive cecropia trees and stands of bamboo that created a green tunnel overhead. When they found the cave entrance, both men fell silent. What the bartender had described as "pretty cool" was actually a gaping vertical shaft that dropped 70 feet straight down into absolute darkness. The opening was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet across, and surrounded by limestone formations that spoke of millions of years of water erosion. Peering over the edge, their flashlight beams seemed to be swallowed by the void below. "Still want to do this?" Jerry asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. David grinned, the same expression that had gotten him into trouble throughout his life. "Come on, man. We didn't drive all the way out here just to look at a hole in the ground." The descent was more challenging than either of them had anticipated. The walls of the shaft were slick with moisture and covered in a film of algae that made every handhold treacherous. They had brought a rope, but securing it proved difficult in the crumbling limestone. Instead, they were forced to climb down carefully, testing each foothold and moving slowly to avoid a potentially fatal fall. As they descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. The tropical warmth of the surface gave way to a damp chill that seemed to seep through their skin. The circle of blue sky above them grew smaller and smaller until it looked like a distant star in the darkness overhead. The bottom of the shaft opened into a chamber roughly the size of a small warehouse, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above their heads. Stalactites hung like frozen icicles, some of them massive formations that had been growing for millennia. But it was the pool in the center of the chamber that captured their attention. The water was absolutely still, its surface like black glass that perfectly reflected their flashlight beams. There was something unsettling about its complete motionlessness: no ripples, no currents, just an eerie calm that seemed to extend down into unknowable depths. What David and Jerry couldn't have known was that this pool was the entrance to a complex network of underwater passages that had been carved through the limestone by underground rivers over the course of geological ages. These tunnels twisted and branched like the root system of some enormous tree, creating a three-dimensional maze beneath the island. Some passages led to dead ends, others connected to different cave systems, and a few opened into air-filled chambers where ancient water levels had left pockets of breathable atmosphere. But to the 2 young men standing at the edge of the pool, it looked like nothing more than an exciting underwater adventure waiting to happen. They slipped into the water, the shock of the cold temperature making them both gasp involuntarily. The pool was deeper than it appeared from the surface. They had to tread water immediately, their feet finding no bottom within reach. With their diving lights cutting through the crystal-clear water, they could see the opening to the first tunnel about 10 feet down and 15 feet from where they had entered. The passage was narrow, perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, but it seemed to extend straight ahead with no obvious obstacles. David went first, swimming down and forward with Jerry close behind. The walls of the tunnel were smooth limestone, polished by countless years of water flow into an almost marble-like finish. After swimming for what felt like 50 or 60 feet, they encountered their first air pocket. The tunnel ceiling rose suddenly, creating a small chamber filled with stale but breathable air. They surfaced together, treading water and shining their lights around the space. "This is incredible," Jerry said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "It's like we're inside the island itself." They rested for a few minutes, then continued deeper into the cave system. The tunnel beyond the first air pocket was even narrower than the entrance passage, forcing them to swim single file with barely inches of clearance on either side. The walls seemed to press in around them, creating an almost claustrophobic sensation that neither man wanted to acknowledge aloud. After navigating several more tight passages and stopping at 2 additional air pockets, they emerged into a larger cavern that felt positively spacious after the constricted tunnels. This chamber contained a small rock ledge where they could actually climb out of the water and rest properly. Sitting on the cold stone, sharing a waterproof flashlight between them, they felt a mixture of excitement and growing unease. "We're pretty deep in here," David said, stating the obvious in a way that suggested he was starting to have second thoughts about their adventure. Jerry nodded, looking around at the limestone walls that surrounded them on all sides. "Yeah, we should probably start heading back soon." It was a reasonable decision, the kind of sensible choice that might have prevented what happened next. But as they prepared to enter the water for the return journey, neither man fully comprehended how dramatically their situation was about to change. David entered the water first, with Jerry following close behind. Their plan was simple: retrace their route through the tunnels, stopping at the air pockets as needed, until they reached the main pool and could surface in the original chamber. It should have been straightforward, after all, they had just swum the same route in reverse less than an hour earlier. But caves, particularly underwater caves, have a way of punishing overconfidence. As they began swimming back through the first tunnel, their movements inevitably disturbed the fine sediment that had settled on the cave floor over years of stillness. This sediment, a mixture of limestone particles, organic matter, and mineral deposits, had the consistency of flour and the suspension properties of smoke. With each kick of their fins and each movement of their arms, clouds of this material billowed up from the bottom, turning the crystal-clear water into an opaque soup. The change was dramatic and immediate. Visibility, which had been crystal clear moments before, dropped to zero in a matter of seconds. David, who was leading, suddenly found himself swimming through what felt like chocolate milk. His diving light, which had been cutting a clear beam through the water, now illuminated nothing but a swirling brown haze that seemed to extend in all directions. Behind him, Jerry was experiencing the same disorientation. The tunnel, which had seemed narrow but navigable on the way in, now felt like a trap. The walls were invisible, the ceiling was invisible, and most terrifyingly, David was invisible despite being only a few feet ahead. In the confusion and growing panic, the two men became separated. Jerry, following his instincts and what he hoped was the correct direction, managed to find his way back toward the main chamber. But David, disoriented by the complete loss of visibility and fighting against his growing panic, made a critical error in navigation. Instead of continuing toward the entrance, he took a wrong turn at one of the tunnel junctions they had passed earlier. In the murky water, with no landmarks visible and his sense of direction completely compromised, he began swimming deeper into the cave system rather than toward safety. The realization of his mistake came gradually, then all at once. The tunnel he was following seemed to be going on longer than it should have. His lungs, which should have been managing the swim back to the next air pocket with relative ease, were beginning to burn with the need for oxygen. And most frightening of all, he could no longer hear or sense Jerry's presence behind him. David's training, what little he had, told him to remain calm, but panic was setting in with the inexorable force of a rising tide. His breathing became rapid and shallow, consuming his remaining air even faster. His movements became jerky and inefficient, stirring up even more sediment and making the visibility problem worse. He was lost, running out of air, and completely alone in an underwater maze that could extend for miles beneath the Caribbean island. Just as his vision was beginning to tunnel and his lungs were screaming for relief, his groping hand broke through the surface of water into air. With a desperate surge of effort, he shot upward, only to crash his head violently into a low-hanging stalactite. The pain was sharp and immediate, and he felt warm blood beginning to flow down his forehead, but the sensation was overwhelmed by the sheer relief of being able to breathe again. The air pocket he had found was smaller than the others they had encountered earlier, barely large enough for his head and shoulders. The ceiling pressed down claustrophobically, forcing him to tilt his head at an awkward angle to keep his mouth and nose above water. The air itself was stale and humid, with a musty smell that suggested it had been trapped in this space for a very long time. But it was breathable, and for the moment, that was all that mattered. Clinging to a narrow ridge of rock that provided the only handhold in the cramped space, David tried to assess his situation rationally. He was lost in an underwater cave system with limited air supply and no clear idea of how to find his way back to safety. The water around him was still murky from the sediment he had stirred up, making navigation by sight impossible. His head was bleeding from the impact with the stalactite, and he was beginning to feel the first symptoms of panic-induced hyperventilation. Meanwhile, Jerry had managed to navigate back to the main chamber, emerging from the tunnel system gasping and disoriented but alive. When David failed to surface behind him, Jerry's concern quickly turned to alarm, then to outright panic. He called David's name, his voice echoing off the chamber walls with hollow desperation. He dove back down to the tunnel entrance, shining his light into the murky water, but could see nothing through the sediment cloud that was slowly dispersing. For 20 minutes, Jerry searched. He dove repeatedly to the tunnel entrance, called until his voice was hoarse, and even attempted to swim a short distance into the passage system before his own survival instincts forced him to retreat. The terrible reality was beginning to sink in. His friend was lost somewhere in the underwater maze, possibly already dead. Back in the air pocket, David was fighting his own battle against despair. The small amount of air in the cramped space was becoming increasingly stale as he breathed it repeatedly. Carbon dioxide was building up, making him feel lightheaded and nauseous. The cold water was sapping his body heat, and the stress of his situation was accelerating his metabolism, making him consume oxygen even faster. He knew he couldn't stay in the air pocket indefinitely. The air quality was degrading, and hypothermia was becoming a real concern. His only choice was to submerge again and try to find his way back to the main chamber, despite the poor visibility and his disorientation. Making what he hoped would not be his final decision, David took the deepest breath he could manage in the confined space, put his diving mask back on, and submerged. Instead of immediately swimming forward, however, he made a critical decision that probably saved his life. He turned off his diving light. In the complete darkness, without the distraction of trying to see through murky water, he was able to detect something he had missed before, a faint glow in the distance. It was barely perceptible, so dim that it might have been his imagination, but it was the only landmark he had. The glow was Jerry's diving light, penetrating just far enough through the settling sediment to be visible to someone looking for it in complete darkness. It was David's lifeline, a beacon that marked the path back to safety. Swimming toward the light required every ounce of his remaining strength and willpower. His lungs were already burning from the extended breath hold, his muscles were cramping from the cold water and stress, and the narrow tunnel walls seemed to be closing in around him. But the light grew gradually brighter as he approached, confirming that he was moving in the right direction. When David's head finally broke the surface of the main pool, Jerry's reaction was a mixture of relief, joy, and residual terror. He had been preparing himself for the possibility that his friend was dead, trapped somewhere in the labyrinthine cave system with no hope of rescue. David clung to the edge of the pool, gasping for breath and shaking from a combination of cold, exhaustion, and shock. The cut on his forehead had continued bleeding during his underwater struggle, and streaks of blood were visible on his face and in the water around him. But he was alive, conscious, and coherent, a much better outcome than either of them had dared to hope for during the previous 30 minutes. The climb back up the vertical shaft to the surface felt like ascending from hell to heaven. Every foot of elevation brought them closer to warmth, light, and safety. When they finally emerged from the cave entrance into the blazing Caribbean sunshine, both men were overcome with emotion. The familiar sounds of birds and insects, the warmth of the sun on their skin, and the simple act of breathing clean, fresh air felt like the greatest luxuries imaginable. Later that evening, back at their hotel, they shared their story with a group of experienced cave divers who happened to be staying at the same resort. The reaction of these professionals was sobering. They explained that David and Jerry had unknowingly entered one of the most dangerous environments on Earth with inadequate equipment, insufficient training, and no safety protocols. The air pockets they had relied on, the divers explained, don't always contain breathable air. In many cases, these spaces are filled with toxic gases or have such high concentrations of carbon dioxide that breathing them can cause unconsciousness or death. The sediment they had stirred up could have remained suspended in the water for days, making navigation impossible and turning their return journey into a potentially fatal maze. Most sobering of all was the revelation that the cave system they had explored was known to local diving professionals as one of the most technically challenging on the island. Several experienced divers had died in those passages over the years, and the entrance was supposed to be marked with warning signs that had apparently been removed or destroyed by weather. David and Jerry had survived their Caribbean cave adventure, but they had come far closer to death than they realized at the time. Their story serves as a stark reminder that natural beauty often conceals natural danger, and that the line between adventure and disaster can be crossed in an instant, often without warning. The experience changed both men's approach to risk and adventure. They never again entered a cave or confined water environment without proper training, equipment, and safety protocols. The memory of those terrifying moments, the complete disorientation in murky water, the desperate search for air, the crushing realization of being utterly lost and alone, stayed with them for years afterward. But perhaps most importantly, their story illustrates the critical importance of preparation, respect for natural environments, and the understanding that some adventures require more than just courage and enthusiasm. The Caribbean cave that nearly claimed their lives was a testament to the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath even the most beautiful and seemingly innocent natural wonders.